You're listening to the Cyberwire Network, powered by N2K.
I would have to say the biggest changes started under the Trump administration with the setting up of the Space Council as well as the space policy directives. I mean, Obama did a lot as well, but what we're seeing is for the first time in years is 3 consecutive administrations working to continue the previous administration's advancement in space and policy, which is really exciting.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Caveat, the CyberWire's privacy, surveillance, law, and policy podcast. I'm Dave Bittner, and joining me is my co-host Ben Yellen from the University of Maryland Center for Health and Homeland Security. Hello, Ben.
Hello, Dave.
On today's show, we have a very special guest. Joining us is Bryce Kennedy, president of the Association of Commercial Space Professionals. Bryce is a space lawyer and a regular contributor to our T-Minus Daily Space podcast, right here on the N2K Podcast Network. While this show covers legal topics and Ben is a lawyer, the views expressed do not constitute legal advice. For official legal advice on any of the topics we cover, please contact your attorney. This episode is brought to you by Palo Alto Networks, the leader in cybersecurity. As AI-driven attacks increase, organizations can't afford to have network security that's stuck in the past. Discover how Palo Alto Networks can help you predict what's coming and proactively secure against it with a zero-trust, AI-powered network security platform built to secure whatever, whenever, wherever. To learn more, visit paloaltonetworks.com/network security platform. Ben, it is my pleasure to welcome to the show Bryce Kennedy. He is the president of the Association of Commercial Space Professionals. He also happens to be a space lawyer, and I know we have lots of questions to ask Mr. Kennedy. Bryce, welcome.
Thank you so much. It's really good to be here.
Before we dig into our questions here, and I know we have a lot of them, can you share with our audience what is your day-to-day in terms of your professional job?
So I run the Association of Commercial Space Professionals. I'm president of that. And ACSP, we work to democratize access to space. And right now our focus is on regulatory training and education, advocacy, and community building.
Gotcha. Well, I want to start off with sort of some basics here, kind of getting a lay of the land. I mean, it's my understanding that recently, I guess since the Biden administration, there's been a lot of change and proposals and so on and so forth for space policy in terms of like who's in charge and who has responsibility. Is that an accurate perception on my part?
Yeah, definitely. I would have to say the biggest changes started under the Trump administration with the setting up of the Space Council as well as the space policy directives. I mean, Obama did a lot as well, but what we're seeing is for the first time in years is 3 consecutive administrations working to continue the previous administration's advancement in space and policy, which is really exciting. And we haven't seen that in decades. So,
what sort of changes are we seeing here? What areas are they focused on?
Well, with the space policy directives, one of them was I can't remember which exactly it was, but they were looking for more agile regulation. And so it was like a 2-for-1 type of thing where 1-for-1, every time you put a new regulation as it pertained to space, you were supposed to remove another one, which I thought was actually a pretty good idea because a lot of the regulatory framework was pretty archaic, where there wasn't actually a lot of commercial space. The other thing that we're starting to see too is the request by the government, by the industry at large to start to form regulations which include new technologies. So these companies don't have to worry about emerging technologies and whether or not the regulations exist, because a lot of times, it's funny, you would not think that these companies would want a regulatory framework because they think that they might be able to work inside of a vacuum. But it turns out that it's the opposite effect. Without that regulatory framework, their tech actually oftentimes will not be approved for the license that they're seeking. And so they're now looking, at the discretion of the FAA, FCC, NOAA, Department of State, all the different entities that work to help the industry for guidance where a lot of times there isn't any. And it's becoming a pretty major backlog on that front.
So we've gone through quite a transformation in terms of who goes into space, right? So 30 years ago, this was a public domain, more or less. NASA was the major player. But in the last 10 or 15 years, obviously we have SpaceX and other private enterprises entering the market. How has that changed the regulatory state, and how is that reflected in the new regulations?
Yeah, I wish there was a major change in that reflection. There obviously have been some changes, and every agency is trying to keep up. But if you look at the FAA, I forget the original licensing for launch and reentry, but they did a sweeping overhaul, and they now have the Part 450, which was supposed to be an answer to that, where private entities could have a little bit easier time to launch in terms of the licensing regime. You see that with the FCC too. There was originally the Part 25, and then there's a simpler version of that based on the size of the satellite itself. So it was more, the new reg was positioned for the new small sats. So you don't want a company that's only putting up small sats to have to go through the burden of a major satellite infrastructure, as say like I said, that would fall under a Part 25. So we're seeing costs reduce for the licensing, as well as some of the timeframes as well. NOAA actually had one of the biggest change under Kevin O'Connell when he was at Commerce. And to me, I wish the other agencies would kind of look at NOAA as the kind of gold standard, because they essentially slashed huge portions of the overall mechanisms that would trigger different licensing techniques, and they put them into 3 tiers. And so if you fall into one of these tiers, your license difficulty is based on that tier, which I think is a really good idea.
When it comes to the various players in the aerospace industry, I'm thinking of all these upstarts that we've had. As Ben mentioned, SpaceX, companies like that. How are the established players in terms of welcoming them, or perhaps using their position as an established player to do some gatekeeping?
So I worked for a startup law firm, a space startup law firm called Aegis Space Law, before I transitioned to ACSP. And we saw a David and Goliath type thing often with different licensing regimes, essentially with companies that are trying to do XYZ, and the big behemoths would often try to use, quote unquote, precedent or all these other different mechanisms to block them. And in the past, that has worked. But now we're seeing, again, a lot more companies that are agile, that have really good attorneys. They're starting to understand, not only with their firms themselves, but in their companies, how these regulatory systems work. So we're starting to see some movement back towards the smaller guys being able to, I wouldn't say have as much power, but a lot more say. The other thing too are the NPRMs, the Notice of Proposed Rulemaking. A lot of companies, the smaller companies, don't realize that they have a lot of say in those NPRMs on different topics that I don't think that they realize how powerful they are. So that's an opportunity too, that companies can start kind of combating these bigger entities.
Can I ask a bunch of dumb questions about space law?
Yeah, please.
Okay. Dave, is that okay?
Please, it's what you do best.
All right, because I want to get really down to basics here. What governs space? Who is the governing authority once we've transcended the surly bonds of Earth and get into the great beyond?
China. No, not yet. Fingers crossed. It is the Outer Space Treaty, 1967, I think. Most nations have signed and ratified it. But the Outer Space Treaty, and it's funny, a lot of people kind of poo-poo the Outer Space Treaty. They think it's just old UN treaty talk that is, not applicable to today's standards, but it still is the governing treaty for all of space. And if you read it, it's really, a lot of scholars have doubled down on the meaning of different aspects and different articles of it, but on the whole, some of the biggest things are that it is meant for exploratory purposes. You can't have nuclear weapons in space. You can't own a celestial body, which means any planet, asteroid, this, that, the other thing. Even though under the Commercial Space Act with Obama, they opened that up to you can't own it. You can extract resources from it, but you can't own it, just kind of like the ocean and the open seas. So that is the big major governing thing. And then from there, it also states that any nation that is a participant of the treaty needs to come up with its own governing body or bodies that they are then responsible for overseeing. And so that's where you'll see a lot of the language from the Outer Space Treaty in the different sections of the FAA, FCC, NOAA, which translates to that authority and those overarching themes that are then embedded in our own system.
So what happens when Elon Musk decides he wants to colonize Mars? Like, what governing processes come into place here, and what could we do about it?
Yeah. Technically, I think that would still fall under, because any company that launches from the United States, still under the Outer Space Treaty, it is seen as that country doing the thing. So the Outer Space Treaty doesn't look at the company, they look at the country. So it would then be on the US to either stop that, to, carve out another rule that says, colonization isn't claiming any property. All we're doing is we're landing there, we're putting these things. What does sovereignty really look like? Is it a time period? Is it a certain breadth of land? What is that? So that is something that it would be under the U.S. The other thing is, I don't know if there's really a body that, we have the Liability Convention that the Outer Space Treaty references as the body that you can't start bringing those things. We've seen a few accidents that almost happened that would have fallen under the Liability Convention, but I don't know exactly if we started bringing that territorial suit, what that would look like in terms of, we would like it to be the UN, but as we see now, the UN, can't really agree on too much.
A little bit toothless,
yeah.
By the way, I don't think Elon Musk will actually ever colonize Mars. He's totally full of it, but it's an interesting, hypothetical. You could see something that's not literally that, but still creates those sort of territorial issues.
The thing is that he's full of it. There's no doubt about it. But I hate to say, what he's done with SpaceX is re-energized the entire industry in a way that we've never seen. I was listening to this podcast with this astronaut. I'm forgetting his name. He was one of the commanders of the International Space Station for a very long time. And he goes, I remember, this is kind of his, I'm paraphrasing him. He goes, I remember when we were at NASA, we would laugh Elon out of the building when he said he would have a reusable and landable rockets onto pads in the ocean. We just laughed him out of the building. And he goes, and I stopped laughing the minute I saw that land the first time in the ocean. And that's the surprising thing about space, is we see a lot of that still, that mindset where people are actually doing the things that, traditionally get them laughed out of the building.
We're going to take a quick break, and we will have more from our guest, Bryce Kennedy, after this message. Now, a word from our sponsor, the Johns Hopkins University Information Security Institute, currently seeking qualified applicants for its innovative Master of Science in Security Informatics degree program. Study alongside world-class interdisciplinary experts and gain unparalleled educational, research, and professional experience in information security and assurance. Interested U.S. citizens should consider the National Science Foundation's CyberCore Scholarship for Service program, which covers tuition and a $6,000 annual professional development allowance, as well as providing a $37,000 additional annual stipend. Apply for the scholarship and the fall semester by March 1st. Learn more at cs.jhu.edu/MSSI. I'm curious, years ago, I was in the world of broadcast television, and I had befriended a satellite engineer. And I remember one day he and I were in master control, and he was lighting the candle, as they used to say, to send our signal up to a communications satellite. And I asked him, what is keeping you from pointing our transmitter at some other satellite and taking its signal down, just stomping on it? And he kind of looked at me quizzically and almost incredulously and said, "We're gentlemen." And I guess I'm the reason I bring up that story is that I'm curious how much of the goings on in space relies on those sorts of norms and politeness, and that it's still a domain, or is it still a domain where those sorts of things that are considered quaint in a lot of other domains now, do they still hold there?
Right. I don't know. I think it's becoming less and less, because what we're seeing, especially from different entities like China and whatnot, is I was listening to another person speak from the DoD, and they were saying that, I don't know if it's daily, but they are constantly thwarting those type of attacks from China and potentially other nations that are making, a business out of bringing down U.S. satellites. I think once you have one player that is actively trying to, disengage other country satellites, then that gentlemanliness starts to potentially move out of the way. Because you can only say that for so long, and then we're seeing what China is doing. They have robotic arms coming out of the satellites as well, where they can start to reposition other country satellites. We have the spoof attacks from the ground. There's a bunch of stuff that we're starting to see where, I would hate for us to try to counter those or become like them. But after a certain point, once national security is at risk, I think a lot of those rules go out the window.
Yeah. Ben?
What do you see in the next 10 to 15 years in terms of confronting China's strength in space and how we're going to work that out diplomatically? I mean, what active steps can the U.S. take to counteract that, if we even do want to counteract that?
According to what I read and understand, the way China is approaching this, which I think is really smart. If I were an enemy of the U.S., I would not do the hand-to-hand combat, not do anything visible that the U.S. citizens could see, because U.S. traditionally we're reactive in nature, and when we react, we tend to win. Some would disagree with that, but when we react, we go pretty hard at it. And so the way that China focuses on it, my father-in-law is an ex-FBI agent. He goes, China focuses on the drip, while Russia focuses on the smash in terms of stealing. And they're using our own kind of socialization of reactivity against us by having this drip, which means everything that they do, whether it's cybersecurity or IP theft or satellite attacks or all these different things, the U.S. can't see. And so there's not a whole lot of a strong reaction. There are some people obviously pounding the war drums, but for the most part, we don't see it from the citizens at large, I don't think. And so I think the thing that the U.S. could do to really strengthen this is start to move away from let's have troops on the ground. I was talking to another crew at Los Alamos, and they're like, oh yeah, we're training for drone warfare on the ground and all this other stuff. Well, the way China's doing it is like, well, we don't even need to worry about drone warfare, because we're going to attack your platform that controls the drones. So we're not even going to let your drones get off the ground. So, really good thing. But that's where if the U.S. can start thinking more in terms of cyber hygiene and cyber security and really leveraging the strength of that and move away from kind of the old military standard, I think we have a really good chance of doing that. The other thing is I really, really believe in the Artemis Accords. I think having the Artemis Accords, where we have a bunch of nations agree to a set of standards, it's not a treaty, it's not legally binding, but the more and more we start having countries believe in this overall mission that the U.S. just put out there, it's not leading. We're just, we're kind of holding the container, but anyone can, grow the way that they like. I think the Artemis Accords is probably one of the best mechanisms for thwarting any kind of enemy like that.
Where do we stand in terms of legislation? I know on the cyber realm, Ben and I always talk about how much it seems that the legislation is lagging behind the industry and lagging behind the technology. Is it fair to guess that that's occurring in space as well?
It is. It is really fair. We see so many backlogs on. If the U.S. is really doubling down on the commercial side to really differentiate itself from the rest of the world and move mountains, then we need to have that legislation that enables quick commerce to be able to act. And we are not seeing that. We're not seeing that at all. And what scares me again is people always ask me, and I'm not a pessimist by nature. I wouldn't be in space if I was, but I still think it's like, what's it going to take? And anytime I've ever seen really massive change, it's always been a disaster, a war, something that has, again, allowed the U.S. to react in a way that kind of woke them up and moved quickly, for better or for worse. So that is, that's kind of where I think we're heading.
Yeah. Ben, last question?
Let's make the last one a fun one. We've had a few hearings about UFOs in the United States Congress. The videos are somewhat compelling. Are you a believer?
Let me say this. I'll say this. I think, based on the evidence and starting to see, especially with the James Webb Telescope, the sheer immensity and vastness of space that we have no idea. Like it's even hard to comprehend that we are the only organism out there. There is a potential for life out there. It's kind of silly to think that there isn't. For me.
Yeah. All right. Well, Bryce Kennedy is president of the Association of Commercial Space Professionals. Bryce, thank you so much for taking the time for us. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
And now, a word from our sponsor, SpyCloud, the cybercrime analytics leader. SpyCloud disrupts cybercrime by telling you what criminals know about your business and your customers, so you can take action to prevent ransomware, session hijacking, account takeover, and online fraud. SpyCloud constantly recaptures and analyzes new data from the criminal underground, including credentials, session cookies, and PII siphoned from malware-infected devices. With knowledge of the specific exposed data criminals have in hand from InfoStealer malware on managed and unmanaged devices, security teams can respond with a more efficient and effective process called post-infection remediation that fits seamlessly into existing incident response frameworks. Get SpyCloud's post-infection remediation guide outlining the 7 steps for preventing a malware infection from becoming a full-blown ransomware incident. Visit spycloud.com/cyberwire. That's spycloud.com/cyberwire. And we thank SpyCloud for sponsoring our show. That is our show. We want to thank all of you for listening. A reminder that N2K Strategic Workforce Intelligence optimizes the value of your biggest investment, your people. We make you smarter about your team while making your team smarter. Learn more at n2k.com. Our executive producer is Jennifer Eiben. This show is edited by Trey Hester. Our executive editor is Peter Kilpie. I'm Dave Bittner.
And I'm Ben Yellen.
Thanks for listening.